Good evening. Appreciate your presence here tonight, and of course we are working our way back through some of the previous lessons that we had missed in the Life of Christ series that we're doing, and I feel like I say that every week, but I just want to keep that in mind of kind of this. It might seem a little bit hit or miss, kind of some of the passages that we're doing on Wednesday nights right now, but if it feels like we're skipping around a little bit, it's because we've already covered some things in the past, and we're trying to fill in some gaps where we've already skipped. So that's the reason for that. And then as we move forward, Johnny will be teaching the next 2 weeks. I'll be out of town. Jen and I will leave with her forensics team next Wednesday morning to go to Washington, D.C. for National Forensics, and won't be back from that until late the following week. So Johnny will cover the next 2 Wednesday nights, and then once I'm back from that trip, Johnny and I will resume the two-man format that Gary and I did for so long. So looking forward to that. So as we've been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount, we are still in Matthew chapter 5, and kind of a quick recap of where we've been because it informs where we're going tonight. Remember that we start off the chapter with the Beatitudes, and those kind of set the stage for everything that follows as Jesus calls people to a way of life in terms that they're not used to hearing their spiritual or religious leaders call them. They're used to being driven by spiritual leaders, by people with whips and prods, beating them to get them to do what they want. And yet here Jesus is calling them. He's leading them like a shepherd. And so he's calling them to a different life. He's really interacting with them in a way that they're not used to. And so that kind of sets the stage for what goes next. And then he talks about being salt and light. And if we are the kind of people that we should be from the Beatitudes, then being salt and light is kind of the natural outflow of that we would be that type of people, and we would be directing people to God because of the way that we're choosing to live, not because of ourselves, but because of what he has called us to. And then we entered in and saw the next couple of verses there, 17 to 20, and that passage there, that section ends with really a kind of laying down a gauntlet. In verse 20 sets the stage for everything that follows in the rest of chapter 5. So verse 20 is the context for everything that would come after that in chapter 5. Verse 20 says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." And saying that, really putting himself diametrically opposed with the religious leaders of the day, he's going to launch into this series of you have heard that it was said, and then he'll present something that the scribes and the Pharisees teach that comes directly out of the old law, and then he'll kind of have a rebuttal to that or a follow-up to that says, but I say to you. And so we saw that last week, that there's this series of verses that say, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And last week we looked at that first one, which is, you have heard that it was said, do not commit murder. But I say to you, don't even be angry with your brother. Don't call him a fool. Don't say to him, Raka, empty-headed one, and those kind of things. So the level that Jesus is calling them to is it's not that he's calling them to an easier lifestyle than the Pharisees and the scribes called them to. He's just calling them to a different lifestyle, and he's putting it in a whole different context. So now we're going to look at where he's taking us next. And so the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to talk about adultery and divorce. And this is the next section after the one that we just looked at last week. So if you're following along by lesson numbers, last week was lesson 24, this week is lesson 25. But I don't think anybody really is following along other than me and Johnny on that as we work our way through the content. So it's interesting to me that last week, I would say maybe out of the ones that were available to the writers of the curriculum, last week and this week, the ones that we're covering are maybe two of the more difficult passages that we'll deal with. And they found a way to leave that out of kind of the general curriculum that a lot of churches are using, and they kind of buried this one in kind of a backdoor route that we took to get to it. So I'm not sure what to make of that, other than I wish Johnny was teaching tonight, but it's okay. But that's okay. We're gonna jump right in, and one of the things that kind of just kept playing through my mind tonight as we looked, as I was preparing for tonight, one of the things that just kept playing through my mind is when we talk about a passage being difficult in the Bible, it kind of comes down to one of two things. It can be difficult because it's hard to understand, like we're not used to that type of language, or there's a metaphor that's being used that we're unfamiliar with, or the language is difficult and it doesn't translate easily from the original language to English, or something along those lines. Like there's something difficult about the passage itself that makes it hard for us to understand. But that's not what tonight is. Tonight is not difficult because it's hard to understand. Tonight is difficult for the second reason. It's difficult because it's hard to implement. It's hard to have the conversation with people, especially often the people that need to hear the conversation the most. It's just a difficult topic to bring up. And so let us not shy away from something because it's difficult. Let us not shy away from something because there's the potential there for conflict as we talk about it with people. But let us look and see what the Bible has to say, and let us be faithful to what the Scriptures say. So that's the approach for where we're headed tonight. And if at any point something seems difficult and we need to stop where we're at and talk through it, let's do that, and not not shy away from the hard questions. And I'm thankful that my elders are here tonight to help me with any answers that I might stumble over, and I mean that sincerely. So I've kind of got ahead of where I intended to get to already. So we've already looked at that passage. Matthew 5:20 kind of sets the stage for where Jesus was going. So Jesus specifically sets us up in verse 20 when he says, "Unless your righteousness is greater than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." It's not then that he's going to launch into a bunch of fluff and easy stuff. He specifically says that so that he can set up some difficult situations, so that he can talk about some difficult things. Because the scribes and the Pharisees, boy, they had all the answers, and they were willing to beat people over the head with it. But he's going to bring up those difficult situations, and he's going to look at them from a different perspective and different angle than the scribes and the Pharisees do. So let's see what Jesus has to say here. We're looking at verses 27 to 32 tonight. I would encourage you, if you have your Bibles, I know I'll have most of the verses up here I think that we want to look at, but if you have your Bibles, open it up, see if you have a different translation, if it says something a little different. Don't hesitate to underline or circle or write in the margins of your Bible as things come up. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and open those up. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, what is it that makes this difficult, makes this passage in some ways difficult? Well, it's the subject matter. It's the fact that in our society today, something like 50% of households are affected by divorce. It's just the world we live in. It's the reality that we live in. And we kid ourselves if we think that doesn't affect the church. It doesn't affect the kingdom. Well, 50 years ago, maybe it was the case that in society, the trends were headed towards a lot of divorce and that being accepted in society. But in the church, we were insulated from that. We were protected from that. And that's not the case anymore. Even if it was the case back then, which maybe wasn't really the case, we were just blind to it. Now, it's not that way anymore. We have to deal with this issue, and we have to deal with it in a scriptural way, in a way that honors what Jesus says, in a way that honors what the Bible teaches, but also in a way that that doesn't harm people that are affected by this topic in the world. And so how do we balance those? How do we make that work? And so that's hopefully something that we'll get into tonight. I don't know that we can come up with all the right answers in one 50-minute class, but we're certainly going to try to come up with some right answers tonight. So let's just start off right here. This is, if there's anything difficult in this passage, this is not it. Adultery is wrong. I mean, we can start there, right? Adultery is wrong. We all agree. Okay, and I think it's clear from this passage that adultery is wrong. It's clear that they were teaching that adultery is wrong back then. I don't think there was an issue that Jesus thought, these scribes and Pharisees got it wrong about adultery. I better correct them. I think the scribes and Pharisees had it right about adultery as well, that adultery was wrong. And so Jesus is not teaching something new here when he's teaching against adultery. But what is he teaching that's new? Well, adultery is wrong, but so is lust. And for a married man to let his mind wander into areas that it shouldn't wander, and then for him to sit back and say, well, yeah, but I didn't act on those things, or I didn't actually follow through on any of those thoughts, or I never really touched her, or I never really spent time with her, I just thought about it. Take it back to what we talked about last week when we talked about murder. Well, that's our starting point. We all agree murder is wrong. But so is hating somebody. And so is wishing ill of somebody. And so is calling somebody a fool or an empty-headed person. Those things are wrong as well. And those are the precursors to murder. Those are the things that lead to murder. They may not always lead to murder, but they're in the same ballpark. And so here, Jesus is saying adultery is wrong. We all agree with that. But so is lust. Whoa, wait a minute. That hits a little closer to home. That's something that's more on me. That's something that I have to actually take inventory of, and I actually have to do some introspection. We talked about that last week and how I'm so great at introspection, right? But it's the same thing here. We have to really examine our thoughts. We have to examine our hearts and make sure that the things that we're involved in are not just those overtly sinful acts, but those precursor things, those less obvious things that lead to those overt acts. And so, I would dare to say that there's not a single case of adultery on record that didn't first begin with lust. It has to start with that desire for something you shouldn't have that leads to that acting on it that takes you to that point. And so if the lust had been kept under control, if the lust had been stopped, the adultery would not have taken place. And so Jesus here lays down, this is where he separates himself from the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees could point to the law, the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. That's pretty cut and dried. That's pretty clear. They could hold that up and they could say, here we are, we're going to hold you to this. And Jesus says, well, let's look at it from a little different perspective. And let's not just think about the act of adultery itself, but let's think about what leads up to it and how we got to that point. And it's those things that lead us to adultery that are wrong as well. And so don't just stop with that act. Stop before that act is even considered. So adultery is wrong, but so is lust. And Jesus separates himself from the pack by saying that. So what is Jesus, what picture does Jesus use about, if you're involved in that sinful act of lust, what should you do? What lengths should you go to keep that from becoming a problem? Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, it is important to start early, and yeah, it is important to start early, in teaching how to avert the gaze and how to turn away and how not to look at things that you should look at, and all those kind of things. But as we look at the passage here that Jesus talked about, what imagery does he give us to help us understand how serious this is? Yeah, if your right eye offends you, what do you do? Pluck it out and throw it away. If your right hand offends you, what do you do? Lop it off and throw it away. So the question then is this: everybody hold up your right hand. Everybody's got your right hand. I don't see any eye patches. So is he serious about it? Is he serious about lust being like a real thing that we need to avert, that we need to avoid? Or is he using hyperbole here to say, it's bad, but it's not that bad? Justin. Right. Good. Okay, so if lust is the sin, is the eye really the problem? Is the eye that's seeing the thing that's being lusted after, is the eyeball itself really the problem? No. If adultery is a thing, if that's a problem, is it the hand that's going into that act? Is it really that hand that's the problem? No. So what really are we supposed to be taking care of other than our eyes and our hands? What is it really a matter of? It's a matter of the heart. Greg. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's exactly right, and I appreciate that. If we're not talking about the physical mutilation of our bodies as being the preferred method for dealing with sin in our lives, but I mean in very practical, it's a very practical question. Would you rather go to heaven without a hand, or would you rather go to hell with both hands? It's a very straightforward question, and it has a very clear answer. You'd rather go to eternity minus a hand and still be with the Lord for eternity than go to and be separated from the Lord for all eternity with both hands. Well, then why is it so difficult for us to excise from our lives those things, those external things that would keep us from spending eternity with God? It's not. If there's a relationship in my life that's an improper relationship, it can't hurt me more to cut off that relationship than it would to cut off my hand, would it? Than to gouge out my eye. Would it really hurt me more to cut off that relationship that's keeping me from heaven than to cut out my eye? I can't imagine that it would. So he's using hyperbole, but he's letting us know that we need to get rid of, we need to chop off, cut out, excise those things that are keeping us out of his kingdom. Johnny. Sometimes we don't want the way out, or we don't like the way out. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is. You're exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll I hope address a couple of those here as we move forward, in some, hopefully in some helpful ways. So what about Moses' command to give a certificate of divorce? Jesus brings it up here. I mean, he brings it up in Matthew chapter 5. And it's not the only place it's brought up. We'll get to another passage in a moment. But he says there in verse 31, whoever it was said, there's another one of those, and it was said, or you've heard that it was said statements, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. So, I mean, is there a provision for getting out of a relationship that we don't want or that we don't like? Well, where did this idea come from? Let's look at it. It's Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. So, it's part of the old law, but Deuteronomy is the second. Deuteronomy literally means second law. It's the second reading of the law, or the second giving of the law by Moses before the people enter into the promised land. And Moses doesn't get to go with them. But before they go in, he gives them a second time through the law. So here, this is part of that that scene there. So verses 1 through 4, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So really, that kind of the last part of that passage is where Moses really is going with that. Kind of the scenario of if the divorce has taken place and if she is remarried and then that one ends in divorce, then she can't go back to the first husband. Really, that last part about she can't go back to the first husband is kind of the big idea from this passage, but it introduces the idea, or it brings forth the idea of there being an acceptable scenario or idea where a certificate of divorce takes place or has been given. And so the scribes and the Pharisees have seen this passage, and they're smart enough and understand nuances enough to be able to say, now wait a minute, let's kind of go back and look at that. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some, I don't know where I point this thing. What, anyway, I had it for a second. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, it's backward. Oh man, I can't do that backwards. Up goes down and down goes up and left goes right. Oh, he got it. Some indecency. Define that for me. He finds some indecency in her. There's a whole lot of things I could define as something I don't like about her. No, I'm not getting specific. Yeah. I don't like the way she dresses. I don't like the way she talks. There's man, if you leave that for me to define, there's not very many of you that will measure up to my level of what I think perfection ought to be, right? But so this is where the scribes and the Pharisees go with this. Well, there were two schools of thought. There were raging battles amongst the different rabbinic traditions about what this meant and when it was acceptable and when it was not acceptable to divorce a wife. And it might even sound like a Judge Judy show or a divorce court show that we would watch today, and they get into the weeds about some really weird stuff about why they want to end their relationships, and those of us that are normal are sitting back thinking, what are they talking about? But they did that. They had some of those same conversations 2,000 years ago. Chuck. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah. Right. Let's let Jesus answer that question, shall we? Matthew 19. So some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him. They wanted Jesus to get caught up in this argument that was going on even in their day, which they would have considered very modern times, of course, for them, right? And it was this argument that was going back and forth between the different rabbinic houses about what is an appropriate reason for divorce. And the scribes and the Pharisees, they want to get Jesus on record. Is he going to side with this rabbi? Is he going to side with this rabbi? Is he going to side, is he going to do his own thing? What's going on? So they come to him, testing him and asking him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. I'm telling you. Why did Moses allow divorce? Because they wouldn't let him not allow divorce. The people were going to divorce anyway. And so Moses tried to codify it, tried to give them, this wasn't just Moses, it was God's law that Moses was the bringer of, but there's a passage later in the New Testament that says the times of ignorance God winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. There was no better system that they could put in place at the time that would allow for anything other than this certificate of divorce to be written. But for those who went so far as to say, when they found an indecency in her, which means I don't like the way she blinked at me at breakfast this morning, she's gone. That's the indecency that I found in her. That was never what it was intended to be. And Jesus here defines and describes what that indecency is. This was the only thing that God ever intended divorce to be about, and that is that the immorality has taken place, that unchastity has taken place, adultery has taken place. That is the only reason that the marriage relationship can be broken. From the beginning, God says, that's the way it was supposed to be. God ties marriage to creation. He created them male and female. Go back and look at what it says. Jesus says he made them male and female. That was God's plan. And as a part of that, he says, for this reason. For what reason? Because he made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the basis of marriage. God made them that way. God designed them that way. He made them to fulfill one another's needs that way. That's what marriage is. And then he says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. If God joins two people together in marriage that are male and female, don't let man separate them for any contrived reason. Don't let them come up with a reason other than immorality to sever that relationship that God has ordained. So that brings it down. In both of these passages that we've looked at tonight, look at Matthew 5:32. Both verses are preceded by the idea of there being a certificate of divorce. So Jesus talks about in Matthew 5, you've read or heard that it was said, give her a certificate of divorce and send her away. But I say to you. In Matthew chapter 19, same conversation, different location, different people, but same scenario. There's the mention of the certificate of divorce, and then Jesus says, and I say to you. Jesus is calling us to a different standard, a different way of life than the scribes and the Pharisees were calling them to, than the law of Moses was calling them to, than modern society was calling them to. So there is one reason for divorce to take place, and that is for immorality. Yeah, right. It applies. It's not just a law for the male. It's not just a law for the females. It's a law for the marriage. It is a law for both of them. So that, and it was interesting. As I was reading through the kind of the stuff for tonight, it was like the next place it went was kind of interesting to me. Well then, what is adultery? If adultery is the only reason or the only thing that is acceptable to allow divorce, we better define it. We better understand what it is, because there are people out there who will try to make it what it's not. And so is adultery the simple act of breaking the marriage vow? And I didn't go into a lot of the scriptural things here, but there are some people that will take passages that you would read in the Old Testament or even the New Testament that called the nation of Israel adulterers in their relationship with God. And well, what was it that led them? Well, it was their idolatry. It was their breaking of the law. It was their not following him the way they were supposed to. There's a host of reasons that could be given of why Israel was called an adulterer. And so then if we take that logic and we apply it to a husband-wife relationship, are there a host of reasons that we could say one spouse or the other is an adulterer? Or is there only one reason that a spouse would be called an adulterer? If there's a host of reasons that Israel could be labeled an adulterer against God, is there more than one reason that I could be labeled as an adulterer against my wife? And the simple answer to that question is no. Adultery, in this context, in these verses, comes from a word that has a specific meaning. And that meaning is the illicit sexual conduct of a married person. So it's not the generalized idea of breaking a marriage vow. He promised that he would love and honor me, and he doesn't honor me. And because he doesn't honor me, he has broken his marriage vow. And therefore, I'm going to leave him, and it's okay. No, that's not adultery. That's not what it means. And so there's not just this general idea of breaking a marriage vow that's tied up in this that says, well, then we're free from one another. There is a specific illicit sexual act that takes place that is defined as adultery. So what is Jesus saying when he says adultery is the only reason for divorce? That's what he's saying. He's not saying a general idea of breaking the marriage vows. Let's look at a couple of passages here that help us kind of understand that. Leviticus chapter 20, and this kind of helps us understand the seriousness of adultery, the why adultery is, if we're going to give one exception to why a divorce can take place, why is it this one exception? Why is this the one that is able to sever that marriage vow? So Leviticus 20:10, as part of the old law, and this would have been, of course, the old law that the scribes and the Pharisees that were familiar with, and they would have used this as part of their part of what Jesus is even speaking about in the Sermon on the Mount. Leviticus 20:10 says, if there's a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one whom commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. That makes it pretty serious. That kind of begs the question then, what's the need for the certificate of divorce if you have a woman that has committed adultery or a man that has committed adultery, and the Mosaic law says the response to that is to take them out and stone them? Do I need to give them a certificate of divorce on their way outside the city before they get stoned so that I'm free from them? That's not the picture I see here. So, it goes beyond just the idea of this is a serious enough offense that it can end my relationship or my marriage relationship. It's a serious enough offense that it needs to be excised from the camp. It needs to be completely removed from our fellowship. We can't allow it to continue. And so it's a serious offense, and one that rises to the level of being severe enough or serious enough that it can break the marriage vows. Now look and see how the scribes and the Pharisees apply that law. So they know Leviticus 20 verse 10. How do they apply it? Well, look at John chapter 8. Same group that asked Jesus in Matthew 19, right? Same group that Jesus talked about in Matthew 5:20 when he says, "Except your righteousness be greater than the scribes and the Pharisees." In Matthew 19, it's the scribes and the Pharisees who come to Jesus and say, "What do you think about this?" And now here it is again, John 8. So they know the law. They've been poking and prodding Jesus about this already. John chapter 8, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. And having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" Okay, so let's list all the things that are wrong with their approach here. Where's the fella? Leviticus 20:10, who was supposed to be stoned? Both of them, the man and the woman. Which one of their buddies did they leave behind in that hotel room that said, "You guys leave me out of this one"? Okay, where was the man? There is no justice here whatsoever. What else is wrong with this? Yeah. Their attitude about trying to trap Jesus in they think they've got him, as they always do. They think if he says let her go, well, he stands in opposition to the law of Moses. If he says stone her, then he has no compassion for the common people. And, they think they've left him with two outs. There's only two responses to this: let her go or stone her. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, they think they've got him trapped no matter what happens here. And the other thing of it is, how did they know where to find this woman? If they knew where and when to catch her in the very act, she's, they've had their eye on this scenario or set up for a while. This is not a crime of opportunity here. This was something they've been waiting for the right moment. They knew where to find her. So they don't really care about this woman in the first place. Otherwise, they would have been trying to minister to her and correct her lifestyle before this. So, there's just a lot of stuff that's wrong with this, not least of which is their interpretation of the law and what it means and what they need to do in response to that. But we include this here not just to pick on the scribes and the Pharisees, as we like to do, but to give us some more insight into the idea of adultery. What is it that made her an adulterous woman? It wasn't that she had, in some general way, broken a vow to her husband, if she has one. It was that she was caught in the very specific illicit sexual act that she was committing, and that act made her an adulteress. And so adultery is not, it's not open to interpretation. It's not open to a wide range of things that can open up the door to other possible scenarios where divorce is okay. Divorce is okay in the case of adultery. That is a great question. And the one back here, the idea of adultery, this word is the only one that's given in the notes is moikia. And I don't know enough about that word to know anything else, but like in James chapter, is it James 4, where God says, "You adulteresses." God calls the people adulteresses because they're friends with the worlds, and they're friends with the world and want to be friends with God, so they can't be both. And he calls them adulteresses. I don't know if it's that same word or not. Somebody who knows more about Greek might be able to tell me. Not off the top of your head? Okay. All right. Okay, so where was I? All right, so we've got to there, okay. There's another verse that was included here in the notes, is just this idea of marriage. Hebrews 13:4, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So the idea of there being a proper outlet, for sexual urges and things like that, and there being a proper view of that physical relationship being within the confines of marriage, and anything outside of that is a defilement of the marriage bed. It's not just that somebody who's married and goes astray has then defiled in some way, but anything outside of that proper relationship becomes a defilement of the marriage bed as God intended it to be. And God then reserves judgment for those who would defile the marriage bed in such a way by being fornicators and adulterers. So, we are to hold marriage in honor, and looking for a way to cheapen what Jesus has said here, or lower the standard for what Jesus has said about how marriage can be ended, is not holding marriage in honor. If we are going to be people who honor marriage the way that Jesus did, we're going to elevate marriage. We're going to say marriage is serious, it's permanent, it's lifelong, and there's only one scenario under which this marriage ends, that other than death, and we're not going to settle for anything less than what Jesus teaches it, and that's holding marriage in honor. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think we can explain it. I think, tell me the verse again, chapter 7, 1 Corinthians 7, 15. Okay. I wasn't looking far enough down the page. Yeah, so Paul has quite a bit to say about marriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and some of it has to do with within that marriage relationship. Some of it has to do with remarrying, a widow remarrying only in the Lord, and there's some parameters for things that take place. But then he talks about if there is a woman who has an unbelieving husband, verse 12. To the rest I say, not the Lord. To the rest I say, not the Lord. So this is Paul giving his authority, or his opinion, which I think is apostolic. It carries weight. I think we need to not just say, well, this is what Paul says, and we can ignore it. This is Paul giving his judgment. He says that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are clean. Now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, a husband, whether you will save your wife? So it's that last verse there that I think gives us some context. First of all, when he says, how do you know, O wife or husband, that you will save your spouse? That means that what he said up above earlier about sanctifying the other one, that doesn't mean that the believing spouse automatically saves. Yeah, so yeah, and so it's not that the believing spouse has the power to save, or through the belief of the believing spouse that the other one will be saved automatically. And so that last part says, through your staying with them, your behavior may lead them. And I think there's a passage in 1st or 2nd Peter where Peter talks about winning the husband, the believing wife winning her husband over by her demeanor. So yeah, so that's my understanding of what Paul is saying here is that if things are so difficult between the believing and the non-believing spouses that the believing spouse has to leave in order to stay a believing spouse, that or drives. I don't think we need to get. I don't think the direction here is the important thing. I think if there's a severing of the relationship, because in order to keep my relationship with the Lord, I have to leave an unbelieving spouse, or my dedication to the Lord means that my unbelieving spouse is going to leave me because I put more faith in the Lord than I do them. Either one of those scenarios, I think, fits here. And so the relationship with the Lord is primary. And so if I can't stay faithful to God and stay married to my wife at the same time, I choose God. But if there is the ability for peace to exist there, and I can stay faithful to the Lord and I can stay faithful to my wife, if both of those things can happen, then that should. So I don't think there's a contradiction here. I think there's just Paul saying that when a choice has to be made between serving the Lord and serving a spouse, we always choose the Lord. Johnny? True, yeah, and I think, yeah. And that's where I was, we've got 5 minutes. This is where I hope to end up. So we started this by saying there are two reasons a passage can be difficult. One, it can be difficult because we don't understand the language, and the language makes it difficult. And we have some passages like that in the New Testament. Read the book of Revelation. Okay? Other times are difficult because they call us to do difficult things. Jesus addresses that in Matthew chapter 19. In Matthew chapter 19, after the passage that we just read, where Jesus talks about, there's only one reason for divorce, and that's it. The adultery is it, and there's no other reason for divorce. Jesus goes on to say, beginning in verse 10, the disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. If I can't get married and divorce her for any reason I want to divorce her, I'm just not going to get married, because that's hard. You're telling me I have to do something hard by not just sending her away for whatever I want to send her away for. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it. Jesus said in Matthew 5, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, pluck it out. Jesus said here, if there's a difficulty in understanding this, what this says, you might have to give up a relationship that is not a good relationship. You might have to remain a eunuch. That is, live outside of the expression of sexual fulfillment. Live outside of marriage. And you might have to do that for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus calls us to. And so is it difficult? I'm not saying it's not difficult. It can be hard. It can be lonely. It can be devastating. But where is our priority? Greg? Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 It doesn't. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think, Lisa. Okay. Yeah. I didn't start back far enough. So if she does depart, let her remain unmarried. There you go. That helps us understand that. Um, thank you. And again, I don't think this passage tells us that we need to go around being marriage and remarriage police and proper divorce and improper divorce police. This is not what this is about. That's not the role that Jesus wanted to fulfill when they threw these questions at him. We simply teach what the Bible teaches, and that's where we have to do that introspection thing. And if we find ourselves faced with this situation, just like any other situation, we have to look at how our life matches up with what Jesus teaches, and we have to make a decision the best we can based on what Jesus teaches us. So, that's where we come down on that. So. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Right. Right. Well, it's Ezra chapter 9, and they did send away their foreign wives and the children of that were a part of those relationships as well. I'd have to look at the language there to be able to say for sure whether that's the same as the idea of a certificate of divorce or whether that's just a severing of that relationship or how you want to look at that. But they sent them back home they sent them back to their place of origin, to their country of origin. So I would read that as divorce. Would be my, but it was not in that case, it was not a sanctioned marriage to begin with. It was not a marriage that God viewed as being a holy union in the first place. And so was it a severing of a proper marriage, or was it the repenting of an improper relationship to begin with? That's probably that second way that I would view it. It was the repenting of a relationship that never should have taken place, which opens up a whole nother can of worms. So, thank you, Chuck, for that. The bell has rung. Yeah. Right. For Johnny will